Yo, hold up, shut it down. Don't hold on to what is now. Don't fall through, cut it out.
So welcome everybody. Hello, welcome to the Yapping with YUCCA podcast. My name is Yaj. Today we'll be having our super special guest, Nic. If you want to introduce yourself for everybody.
Hi y'all, I'm Nic. I'm a writer, educator, historian, and artist living in Tiwa territory, and I'm really looking forward to talking with y'all today about Mormonism and settler colonialism and environmental destruction and survival.
Yay.
Yeah, my name is Savannah. I'm on YUCCA Steering Committee. I use she, her pronouns, and I was first introduced to Nic's work through their political education workshops on settler colonialism. And I've taken 2 of them, and both times I was just so moved. Like, I think I even cried one time, but it really hit close to home for me because I was also raised Mormon in Utah, and I found my way to this environmental work as well. And yeah, I just really love your work, so I'm excited.
Thanks, Savannah. I appreciate that.
Maybe we should start off talking about settler colonialism. So would you please explain what that is and how it differs from other types of colonialism?
Yeah. So Patrick Wolf kind of wrote like the founding essay, I guess, of what settler colonialism is. It's called Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native. So he writes about how the settler comes to stay. So colonialism is always a project of taking over and replacing economic, political, spiritual, just the entire lifeways of a people and a place. And settler colonialism differs because the settler seeks to replace the native or indigenous peoples, whereas colonialism just seeks to control them, maybe replace their leadership, definitely replace their politics, economic, spirituality, family ties, all of that kind of stuff. But in settler colonialism, it's a destroys to replace, is another one of his lines, is that. So in that way, as we're all hearing, as white supremacy is given more permission to be publicly spoken again, you hear a lot of white people who refer to themselves as Native Americans. And so even in that language, and then there's an entire history of destruction and replacement that goes with that, where you had to eliminate indigenous peoples in order to then believe yourself to be Native American. And family systems, that's one a really common phrase of the right is like faith, family, and freedom, which I tie very much to like the Nazi concept of blood and soil. And so family is, in my mind, often just a dog whistle for white supremacy, for blood, for that concept of, pure blood, pure families, white families, which is part of removing other people who have indigenous, have indigenous ties to the land. That's the main difference between other forms of colonialism, of like British colonialism, of setting up colonies, versus U.S., Australian, Israeli colonialism, of settler colonialism.
Got you. Thank you for that. That definitely is very good information to see where those kinds of tactics and systems lie.
Yeah, Nic has written a biography of their great-great-great-great-grandpa, who was a settler colonist of Utah. And I want to ask, what is it that inspires you to study this topic and educate others about it?
That can be a pretty long story. So this goes back to... So I left Mormonism when I was 18. That's the stage at which Mormon people raised to be boys, which I was, are commanded to go on a proselytizing mission for the Mormon church. And at that point, I had always been Mormon because everybody was. My school teachers were, my friends were, my parents were, everyone I knew basically was Mormon. And so you just were, because it's, how many of us think about why we're going to school? You just do because everybody does. And so I'd left, and that's, it left me pretty unsettled because in Utah, Mormonism is everything. It's your cosmology, it's your spirituality, it's your politics, it's your family, it's your friends, it's everything. And so then I kind of was free floating in space, not knowing what to like fill those understandings of my connection to life with. And that's when I went to the land and started to learn from it and listen to it and just be with it. And that really helped fulfill some of that spiritual need that I had been lacking after leaving. So then fast forward some years and I became an artist, and a lot of my work was about that relationship. It was specifically about stones because I grew up in Nuwu territory occupied by St. George, Utah. And in that land, it's where the Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, and the Mojave Desert all meet and then become each other. And so it's a really dynamic landscape filled with some really unique ecosystems. And there's also a lot of beautiful rocks there. And so it was really rocks that I started to develop that deeper relationship to, something like a God, in that it's something that has lived well before me and will live well beyond me. And so is this sort of constant witness. And so I would talk to rocks, and through those conversations try to understand my place in the world, tried to understand how to emotionally and spiritually handle living during, the sixth extinction and climate collapse, and also to help encourage other people to reconnect with land in that deeper spiritual as well as practical physical way. And so while doing that work, I ended up in grad school here in Tiwa territory at the University of New Mexico. And while at the University of New Mexico, it is harder here to ignore settler colonialism because it has been less successful at completely eliminating the peoples and their voices. And so I started to think about that more. And then I saw a Red Nation presentation while I was in school too. And that really clicked something for me, that I was doing all of this work about my relationship to land and the love that I have for it. But there is an entire deeper layer of relationship I have to the land that I haven't talked about. So pairing that of settler colonialism is a relationship to land. It's not one most of us want to think about, but it is a relationship I already have to land. And so that then gets paired with a lot of my work with the stones was very intuitive. And as a person raised to be white and a man, I have a lot of unhealthy biases already set into my body and mind. And even though I have had people kind of push back on my use of intuition, because I think intuition can be a different thing, but when your intuition and your biases have never really been questioned, how do you know the difference between them? And so I started seeking to learn my history in order to find where my unconsidered, unthought biases come from, where my implicit biases come from. And so that's when I started studying Mormonism. And while studying Mormonism, I started to learn how impactful they were as settler colonists of the so-called American West, and how much the story of the American West is really a story of Mormonism, even though that will almost never be told. And so all of those layers together in learning about ecological destruction and the sixth extinction while in school, because my program was on art and ecology, I started to recognize that connection, that settler colonialism, environmental destruction, and my relationship to land are all tied together. And if I want to encourage my fellow people to have a better relationship with land, I think we all need to start with the relationship we all deeply embeddedly have. Because I grew up in an abusive home, and so I really connect it to abuse a lot as a metaphor of thinking about like, we have all abused the land, or our inheritance is land abuse. And so would the land just want to take us back without a real thoughtful, well-researched apology? And so those are all the layers as to what drove me toward this, is that I want to live in a future where the land is alive. I don't want to live in a mechanized future. And so, yeah, this was the work of trying to figure out what my place is in that work.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. There's a quote in the biography you wrote that I wanted to read really quick. Our generational trauma seated in these histories are remade over and over again in the bodies and interpersonal dynamics of each new generation. I think that's so true, how like the violences enacted by our ancestors are not disconnected from the violence that we experience in our own homes, whether that be emotional or physical. With Utah, it's very much like the American dream, like nuclear families and everything looks perfect. But the families are very, very dysfunctional when you get up close. And I'm excited to dive more into all this.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I heard so many like points that you brought up I could relate to, but also as an Indigenous person is interesting because we both kind of suffer from that. We mentioned earlier off the record about like how colonialism is like a disease, like it spreads like a disease. It's people that know like how it affects people like call it evil because it's so destructive. And it's like, it's not good for anybody, even the white people that are using it for their quote unquote benefit.
Yeah, that's a really important point that I try to reiterate a lot, is because, another layer is that I was starting to get into sort of social justice work and wasn't sure where my place as at that time, I thought I was a cishet white man. And so where do I fit into that work? And because for the most part, especially, coming into this work in like the 2016s, it was very much like ally stuff. And so like white people were doing things to uplift other people, to bring them up to the level of peace and prosperity that we have. And so through doing this work, it started to flip that. And I've been like, oh no, we are the ones who, lots of writers have written about like the soul death of whiteness, the soul death of settler colonialism, that in order to enact those kinds of violences on other people, let alone the land, requires a certain kind of death. And so this is absolutely work for us to do, us being the settler colonists. It's not a favor to anyone else. This is like they call it a mutual stakes is one of the words, the sort of buzzwords of it. But that we are all intertwined in this work. And so I definitely do this not as a out of pity or guilt or anything like that. I do it out of self-preservation.
Totally.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, decolonization or extinction, as the Red Nation says. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the ecological destruction of Utah, because the Great Salt Lake is very much in danger, and that's not even the first lake that Mormons have dried up.
Yep. Yeah, so when these European colonists, at that time Mormonism was predominantly British or longtime settler colonists from the Brits. So the biography that I wrote about my great-great-great-grandpa, his name's Alma Helaman Hale. His ancestors showed up to this continent as Puritans in the 1600s, like just after the so-called Mayflower journey. And so it was mostly British, Northern European colonists. And so they got over to the Great Basin and tried to farm in the ways that they were familiar with in much wetter lands. But because they did not have the rainfall, they developed really, really impressive systems of irrigation. On one hand, they are very impressive. They were some of the only people, because Mormons moved over to the, Timpanogos and Goshute and Eastern Shoshone lands as a collective, they were able to do these massive public works projects that the people who were moving more as just, individual families were not able to do. But through those irrigation projects, they misunderstood the ecosystems that they were colonizing, and so they desiccated so many rivers and lakes. The Sevier Lake has been drained since the 1880s. Several rivers have been turned into washes. We can get into the whole ecology that if you try to channelize a perennial stream, then when it inevitably floods, because that's how our water systems work out here, is kind of a lot and maybe not so much. And then it widens it because it tears everything apart once you've straightened it, and then you destroy the wetlands, and then once the wetlands go, the land desiccates. And so it's really just been these layers and layers of, to give them some credit as humans, that they just misunderstood. They didn't know what they were doing. They also didn't think to ask. So through that, and then that's just continued on and on. Lake Powell was a project that was predominantly lobbied for by Mormon senators. They saw it as a project to preserve their irrigation systems, and, which, we'll get to this eventually, but as a way to also so-called uplift the Dene people, because Mormonism within that project is also a project to assimilate indigenous peoples, because their scripture is a mythology about the history of this land and its indigenous peoples. But anyway, so continuing those water projects, those irrigation projects, those damming projects, they've continued to overuse and misunderstand the land and won't learn from their lessons. And so there's this double effect happening around the Great Salt Lake, which, Lake Mead and Lake Powell are also becoming disappearing. They're becoming desiccated as well. But the Great Salt Lake, there's an added irony in that the Utah Lake and the Great Salt Lake have also been used as dumping grounds for a lot of the heavy industry up there. The Kennecott copper mine up there is one of the largest open pit mines in the world. And so there's all these layers of toxic chemicals that are in the bed of the Great Salt Lake. And it's always been a shallow lake. But and it is estimated to run pretty dry, and even if it just sort of shrinks in size another like 50%, then all of that lake bed is going to turn into dust. And Salt Lake also has this really major issue with wind and I forgot what that's effect, where all of the smog gets trapped in the area because of the climate systems there. So it's going to be an unlivable place if radical changes aren't taken soon. It's hard to guess these things, but the estimates are like, 10 years. I haven't looked at the information in a little while, but it's like not a distant future. It's a current future that we're looking at. And I tie those things all the way back to day one, because they started day one. And in layers and layers of that was one of the many ways that they committed genocide against the Timpanogos people, is they would overfish and then sell the fish to people passing through on their way to Oregon or Colorado or wherever else on those major trails that did pass through Salt Lake. And then, of course, the Timpanogos started to starve, and so then they started to take the food that was on their land, and then Mormons saw that as an act of violence, and so committed acts of violence in reaction, and that led to wars and genocide. So yeah, the water, of course, water is life, as has been said so many times by indigenous leaders. So yeah, that's Anyway, another layer of the settler colonialism is that one of the first lines in Patrick Wolf's essay is that land is life, and thus contests for land often are contests for life. And Mormons needed more than was even available, and let alone enough to share. That's kind of a backward way of looking at it since you're the newcomers, but let alone enough that the indigenous peoples who have been there since time immemorial could survive as well.
Yeah, you've written that after just 50 years of Mormons arriving in Utah, about 90% of the indigenous people there had died due to war, starvation, disease, and all the other consequences of Mormon occupation that you mentioned. Yeah, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about why Mormons came and what exactly all of their migration was about. Yeah.
Yeah. So Mormonism was invented in the early 1800s. There was an era in Upper New York where a lot of new forms of Protestantism were being invented. It was kind of a hotbed for inventing a new church and getting new members. And the founding Mormon prophet Joseph Smith was around that area. And, the story goes is that he prayed to ask which of those churches was true. And he had a vision where God and Jesus showed up in their celestial divine flesh and told him that none of them were true and that they were going to guide him to find this book that was written on these slabs of gold that was written by an ancient, supposedly indigenous person. And that was going to tell the true story of Christianity and Protestantism. And it was going to connect it to this land, which has its own whole history, because when, Christian colonists, settler colonists got to this land and realized it even existed, it's not in the Bible. This continent isn't in the Bible. And the Bible is the whole truth for these people. And so they needed to find ways of making this fit. And so one of the ways that they did that is there's the story of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And so they were like, oh, these people must be among the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And that concept is before Mormonism. It was written about by others. And so Joseph Smith found/wrote, depending on your belief system, this book that states that indigenous peoples are descendants of ancient Israelites who were, quote, white and delightsome and traveled here by boat, that just like Noah, God showed them how to make a boat. And then they traveled over here and began to colonize the land. And anyway, the story goes is that these people were white and delightsome. They split into two groups. One group chose to continue to be patriarchal Christians, and one group chose to rebel against that patriarchal God as well as their own earthly patriarchal parents. And to keep them separated, God created a system of racialized segregation, and he cursed the rebellious people with a skin of blackness, is the quote in there, so that they could tell each other apart of who was a good guy and who was a bad guy.
I've only heard like bits and pieces of this story, but hearing it all chronologically is insane.
Yeah.
It's really insane. But once again, one of those things where it's like, is it really that surprising? So many things like this happen all the time.
Yeah.
So wild.
Yeah, it's really similar to the narratives you will hear from Zionists about who Palestinians are, that it erases their indigenous connection to the land in order to establish an indigenous connection for Zionists to that land. Mormons did the same thing, because by inventing Lamanites, who are those cursed dark-skinned people who are then written in the Book of Mormon as the ancestors of contemporary indigenous peoples, it allows them to steal the land without any moral misgivings. They can still believe they are the chosen people and simultaneously be genocidal massacre killers, because it's part of a divine pathway. So
Also like very intentional. like it. I'm realizing now. I said it's like insane. It does sound insane, but then if you were to like talk about the true intentions,
Yeah.
of like why they're doing each of these actions, it's like it's strategy.
Yeah, and Mormons refer to Utah as Zion, which I wonder if there's like parallels with that, but we've all heard of like Zion National Park in Utah.
Yeah. Yeah, so the Zion thing is very much, it's a story in the Bible, and Mormons cast themselves as the perpetuators of the New and Old Testament. So this ties into why they had to move so much as well, but Mormons cast themselves as, quote, the only true church. I don't know how old that specific language is, but that's the language I was raised with, that I am a part of the only true church on earth. And so they teach that as soon as there was like an officially organized Christian church, which they mostly pin on Catholicism, that's when it fell away from Jesus's true teachings. And Mormonism is the first iteration of Christianity to restore the original true gospel of Jesus. And they also tie themselves as Israelites. So they called themselves Israelites in the early part of their history all the time. They called their land Israel, themselves Israelites, and their chosen land was Zion. So, they're just following the same Bible stories. Like they say that they found a desolate, barren wasteland. Netanyahu says that the Zionist Jews found a barren wasteland when both of them were populated. Palestinian agriculture is known throughout the world, and so it's objectively false, but it's a Bible story, and so like, the insanity versus the rationale strategy is like, within their insanity, yes, they're being strategic and rational, but it is, you have to suspend real reality to believe those strategies, to follow them. So they're Zionists, and so they're everywhere they go, they're going as a group, and they're going with the idea that where they are is divinely theirs. At first, they're still in the already colonized, already settled regions of New York, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois are the lands that they end up settling before they come out to, colonize the land they occupy as Utah. And because everywhere they went, they came with that ideology, and with a large group of people, they upset others around them. Yes, people also didn't like their belief system, that they took Protestantism and changed it in a way that other Protestants found to be heretical and blasphemous. And so that is accurate. But for the most part, I don't think that would have created the same kind of contention that was created if they weren't also showing up and overtaking the political and economic systems. They were settler colonists of settler colonists. So they were showing up to places and trying to destroy and replace the existing political and economic systems with their own. And this does go all the way back to their Puritan ancestors, because there's also a myth that Puritans were escaping religious persecution, and so they came to the Americas for religious freedom. The religious freedom they sought was the freedom to completely dominate the place that they were. Protestants didn't like the limited religious freedom that had already existed in England, and so they fled to Denmark, which maybe it wasn't Denmark at that time, but I'm not super clear on European history, and Europe isn't even Europe that old ago. But anyway, they moved elsewhere in Europe, and then moved over to the Americas to escape religious persecution, when really what they wanted was absolute dominance of the political and economic system, so that everyone had to follow their Puritan ethics. Mormons do the same thing. They show up everywhere they go. They land in places that are already settled, and they become the sheriffs, the mayors, they occupy all of the political roles. They run the banks, they run the stores, and they overtake the already existing culture that isn't as unified as they are. And so that upsets the balance, whatever balance, limited balance already exists in these places, and the settler colonists who are being settler colonized get upset and fight back. And so And in many of these cases, what's actually happening also, when I was raised, I was taught that it was outsiders who were upset at them, which it was partly the outsiders. But who is also upset is their own apostates. So in Ohio, for example, Joseph Smith started a bank, an illegal bank, but also illegal banks were common at this time. There was one of the U.S.'s first Great Depressions happened in this time period of like the 1840s, maybe 50s. And so the bank fails. Many of his believers, his followers, believed that this bank was ordained of God because Joseph Smith had said that, and that if they all followed the rules properly, the bank would never fail. So people are putting, their livelihood, their entire, their whole financial wealth into this bank, and then it collapses within months. And so a third of his congregation apostatizes, leaves the church, and becomes enemies of the church, of Joseph's church. And so that's a story they also leave out, is that a lot of this is internal as well as external. So they get pushed out of Ohio because of that, often by their own members. One of my fourth great uncles, who was Alma Helaman Hale's uncle, he was an apostle, which is like he was among the top 15 most powerful people in the church. And he actually apostatized and went into the Ohio Mormon temple with a gun and was like threatening everybody because he was so pissed about how he lost everything in this bank failure. Anyway, so then they go to Missouri, and Missouri is the story people maybe are more familiar with. There's an extermination order actually put out against the Mormons. And in the governor's mind, he's like, we had a place where people were getting along well enough here, and then the Mormons showed up, and that stopped happening. And so you all got to leave, because you're not making this work out. And then there were militias who showed up and, massacred some of them. They were actual victims of real violence. But I choose to not frame it necessarily as persecution so much as they picked a fight and lost. Yeah. And so then from Missouri, they were forced out into Illinois, which another interesting part of this is Ohio was near the border of the current U.S., and as the Mormon church continued to grow and change, the U.S. continued to expand its borders further and further west. So when they were in Ohio, they were near the U.S. border. When they moved to Missouri, the U.S. border had moved to Missouri, and then when they moved to Illinois, they were also on the river at the border of the U.S. And so they were always on the border of indigenous territory and U.S. occupied territory. And part of that was it was really easy to escape criminal prosecution by crossing the border, in the same way that if you cross state lines, you would be able to avoid being chased by the state police. You would be out of their jurisdiction. And so that was also one of the reasons they kept moving, is that Joseph Smith and some of his other leaders continued to have criminal, he had warrants out for his arrest, and so they would move to a new place where he could escape those warrants. Anyway, so in Nauvoo, some more of his members get upset at him because he's practicing polygamy and marrying other people's wives and daughters. He would send men out on missions, and then he would marry their wives while they were gone.
He did that to my great-great-great-great-grandma. Her name was Zina. And he sent her husband Henry out on a mission and then married her while she was pregnant with his baby. Yeah. And then Brigham Young married her after Joseph Smith had married her, which is insane.
Yeah, Brigham Young married a lot of Joseph Smith's wives after Joseph was murdered. So he's marrying people's wives and daughters. And this is also upsetting the locals because that's one of their conversion strategies, is they're getting the women and children of these other groups and bringing them into their group. And, polygamy is also a complicated topic because it was seen as not white. It was seen as primitive, but that was because of African and indigenous tribes, or, indigenous African and indigenous to this continent peoples. Some of them did practice polygamy, or polygyny, which is really Mormon is polygyny. Polygamy is multiple spouses. Polygyny is multiple wives. And so the U.S. saw Mormons as not white because of that. And so that was something that upset them. But it also upset them because they were stealing their families. Anyway, so a couple Mormons decided to write a newspaper, and expose some of this stuff. And Joseph Smith decided that that was a threat to his order. And at this time, he was the mayor, the captain of the local militia, and the judge of the town. And he was the prophet, and he declared himself priest and king among his people. Anyway,
Mr. Do-It-All.
yes, he wore a lot of a lot of hats of power. Anyway, so he declares martial law, commands for the newspaper to be burned and the building to be destroyed. Then he gets arrested for declaring martial law because he's not allowed to do that. By the governor sends out a warrant, and he's about to run away out to the Rocky Mountains because there was already plans for them to do that. And he gets a letter from some of his friends that's like, don't run away again. And so he comes back, gets arrested, gets murdered while he's in jail by apostates and other locals who, in my mind, are justifiably upset. I don't know that what they did was a justifiable thing to do, but I think their anger is justified. Anyway, he gets murdered. The church splits. One group stays here and one of Joseph Smith's children becomes the leader of that group. And then the major part of the group follows this next prophet, Brigham Young, out to Timpanogos, Goshoot, and Eastern Shoshone lands, and then they do the Pioneer Trail and colonize Salt Lake City, and then that becomes their Vatican, and it can they continue to grow and assimilate to the U.S. and there's a whole bunch of more history once we get there.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into Mormons' relations with the indigenous people. I think most Mormons definitely do not know this history, but it's really important to go into it because it's really just unbelievable when you've grown up in that. But yeah, there was the Timpanogos Extermination Order, which was unanimously agreed upon by the First Presidency because they agreed that the only way to maintain their occupation of the Utah Valley was to exterminate the Timpanogos from their land. And yeah, a week after this order was passed, the Nauvoo Legion began the Fort Utah Massacre, where 50 Mormon soldiers opened fire on sleeping families of a Timpanogos village, and that's just scratching the surface. But is there any history you want to go into there?
Yeah. So the story I grew up with is that Mormons were a kinder, gentler settler colonists than the U.S. in general. Brigham Young has a famous line that it's cheaper to feed them than fight them. He also has some less famous lines where he says something about if you want to destroy them, civilize them.
I have another quote. He said, "I say go and kill them. Let the women and children live if they behave themselves. We have no peace until the men are killed off. Never treat the Indian as your equal," which he said about the extermination order.
Yep. So, he's very... and I also... Anyway, the line with peace, like that's a part that I think really stands out because I was seeing that a lot in coming out of Israeli leaders that they, we continually talk about how they just want peace, but their version of peace is complete submission and domination of the other, or who they've rendered the other. And so that was very much the Mormon project. And also in Patrick Wolf's essay, he writes about how we often, as academics thinking about genocide and colonization and settler colonization, we put a line between cultural assimilation and biological genocide. Because cultural genocide and biological genocide were like, well, we didn't murder anybody, so it's okay. And kind of, like it's using current events. Like Charlie Kirk's rhetorical violence is totally okay, but someone murdering him is like, that's a hard line. So it's a similar kind of ideology that we have around cultural genocide, assimilation, and biological genocide of, warfare and disease, spreading of disease intentionally, and starvation. But Patrick Wolf points out that we shouldn't draw that line because cultural genocide, indigeneity is not a racial thing. It's not a genetic thing. It is a cultural thing. So destroying a culture is destroying a people. It is still genocide. You are eliminating a people by assimilating them. And so Brigham Young's line between feeding them and outright destroying them is an arbitrary line. And he knows this because he has other quotes where he's talking about how they were able to wipe out, he says, there's not 1 in 10, maybe even 1 in 100 of them left. And did we fight them? No, we fed them. And so he's fully aware that assimilation is just as deadly to these people as militant violence and the spread of disease. And those stories are reiterated all throughout. Like you had pointed out, 90% of all indigenous peoples who are occupied by Mormon colonization, 90% of them were dead within 50 years, were killed within 50 years of Mormon arrival to their lands. But there was somewhat recently a TV show called American Primeval, which was, in my opinion, a horrible depiction of the Mountain Meadows Massacre and the Bear River Massacre. But the Mormon-run newspaper, Deseret News, wrote an article about how it was inaccurate, which it was, but not for the reasons they said it. But they were like, we had good relationships with the indigenous people. For example, Shoshone are some of the main characters in this show. And they were like, we had great relationships with the Shoshone. Most of them joined our church. But what they leave out is that the Mormons requested the U.S. military come and destroy the Shoshone, which the Bear River Massacre is still one of the U.S.'s largest massacres in our history. And yes, the Mormons didn't enact it, but they asked for it to be done, and they celebrated it happening. And then the survivors did join the Mormon Church. And as part of their payment for being taken in by the Mormons, they were forced to build the temple that is on their land. And these were major, major projects. Like building these massive, 4-story stone buildings in the 1880s was an obscene, it was a huge project. And so the Mormons twist it as there are a lot of indigenous people who joined the church at these times. And so we were clearly on the good side. But it's also well, look at the American Revolution. Indigenous people were fighting each other, whether they chose that siding with the British was their better chance of survival or siding with the new American nation was their better chance of survival. And so it's really about how do you survive genocide? And different peoples chose different tactics. Sometimes they switched tactics after one tactic had devastating results. Because, we settler colonists are brutal people with, very few limits as to what we're willing to do to occupy land. Goshoots were one of the people. There's also, if you happen to be Mormon or you've learned Mormonism at all, you might know about the sago lily, which is on their flag. It's their state flower. And Goshoot people knew how to eat the bulbs of this flower in hard times to survive. And so they helped the Mormons survive in this landscape that they had no experience with. And then, as soon as Mormons had the population and power, they destroyed them and pushed them out of that land. So it's all throughout. It's the same story repeats in different ways.
Mm-hmm. That's what I'm hearing you say too, is on top of you mentioned earlier about the ecological effects of settler colonialism, but then you talk about the social hierarchies and the way that people treat people in those systems. And it's so interesting. You talk about the attitudes that people kind of tell in the story, that we were the good guys, we were providing, but providing resources meant depleting every other resource so that you were the only resource.
Yep.
And they could only come to you and only come to support or, like you said, side to survive and make hard choices, because the ecosystem that was supposed to be there and ever flowing the way that many indigenous people just knew how to work with was suddenly gone, which is just like crazy to hear. And then the story gets changed, so people don't know about those things in the way that like indigenous stories are told, where everything is connected. But in colonial stories, everything's disconnected, and the only good things that happen is because someone decided, I'm going to be good today.
Yep. Yeah. And that disconnection, like that's, way back when I was doing my work about like the stones, that was like what I was trying to be, of like, we are really disconnected from so much, and we need to reconnect, which is a part of this project, is like, we need to reconnect with our history. We also, for the most part, white people don't have a connection to their ancestors. And if they do, it's a, cherry-picked connection. And so that's also a really important part of this project for me, is that we settler colonists need to learn the stories of our ancestors, and not just the ones that were kept by our ancestors, but we need to learn, find out where they lived, where they colonized, and then learn the history of that land from other sources, especially indigenous sources, so that you're actually learning the whole story, because we are very good at telling partial stories that make us look good. And yeah, like you said about the land, like that's a really important one that often gets overlooked, is like, why did these people who had survived for thousands and thousands of years suddenly need food and water and shelter and protection? Yeah, that's not a mistake. And it's the destroy and replace. Mormons brought European cattle with them. They sent the cattle out to graze on lands that had been grazed by deer and elk and all the other animals that indigenous peoples had been living with and cultivating a healthy relationship with for time immemorial, let alone all the seeds that they could also gather that were part of those grasses that the cows are now destroying, because especially in the Southwest, cattle, there's no large ungulate that evolved with these lands. And so they desiccate the lands, they destroy the lands. Cattle in the Southwest are the leading cause of species extinction, because of the way they interact with our riparian zones and the, vulnerable grasses. And so it was very much, we replaced our food systems with their food systems, and then they were starving. And then they started to eat the animals that were now on their lands. And Mormons saw that as private property theft, which is, in the capitalist, white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant world, a capital crime, but made no connection to all the theft that they were engaging in, because, again, this gets back into the ideology. This is God's land, their God's land. The Christian God made the entire world. This is doctrine of discovery, by the way. The Christian God made the entire world, thus all land belongs to Christians. And so it's actually, they're doing divine work, they're doing good work by coming in and forcibly assimilating or destroying indigenous people and then taking the land. So like one of their other leaders, Heber C. Kimball, before the Fort Utah massacre, he said to remove all Timpanogos from the Utah Valley, which was called the Timpanogos Valley, because they have no rights to that land. Because he's talking in this ideology of divine rights to land, not relationship to land, not connection to land, which they obviously have. So yeah, it's on all layers, spiritually, economically, food ways, cultural ways, everything is destroyed and replaced.
Thank you for going into detail with that.
Yeah, speaking of that, destroying and replacing, Mormonism focused a lot on converting Native Americans in their early years. To what extent were they successful in that endeavor?
It was mixed. It depends on the people. With Timpanogos, I don't think they were successful at all. I don't know for certain about that, but the the population who is left, as far as I'm aware, are mostly not Mormon. At least their leadership is not. But like Nuwu, where I grew up, the Southern Paiute is what colonists call them. A lot of their people are converted, especially the ones in Utah. And there's, whole histories I could go into as to why and how that happened, but it's very much like this is our best bet of survival. Because Nuwu had already been struggling when Mormons got there, because the Spanish were already around. The Spanish Catholics were already doing these same kinds of things. No, the Spanish never really settled in Utah, but the Old Spanish Trail goes right through Nuwu territory, like right through the heart of it. It follows their waterways, which in the Southwest, the water is especially life. And so their trail had to follow the water, partly because those trails were already established by indigenous people, because we're all animals, we all need water and food, and so we follow those paths where it's most abundant. And those went right through their lands, and they were being enslaved by Nuevo Mexicanos and the Spanish. And so while people would travel through their lands from Santa Fe to California, they would kidnap men, women, and children, mostly women and children, which destroys the people's lifeways. And so by the time Mormons got there, they were already a people who were struggling to survive. They weren't who they were before Spanish colonization, which Nuwu have connections to Pueblo people. They were living in Pueblo structures prior to colonization, like the Hopi, like the Tiwa and Tewa, and all the peoples here. And so they were, ancient relatives. Their ancestors are like shared knowledge with Pueblo and Hopi peoples. Anyway, but by the time the Mormons got here, they were in survival mode, and so they were eating roots and living far away from their water systems. But they were still farming, like when the colonists, Escalante and who's the other guy's name? Their names are all over the place in the Southwest, because they were the first Catholic colonists to get into lands occupied by Utah. Anyway, they commented on the abundant farms that, like one of the main river systems in the area I grew up in was called Corn Creek, or got named Corn Creek by these colonists, because there were so many corn farms along the river. Anyway, so they're barely surviving, and they're like, look, it's the U.S. is going to come in and take over, or the Mormons are going to come in and take over, because the Mormons and the U.S. weren't friends at that era. Because the U.S. didn't see them as white, and they were, the wrong kind of Christian, and they were a little bit entitled about, being the only true ones. And so a lot of them chose to assimilate and fight with Mormons. Some of them would even fight against, like, Dene, because Dene, led by leaders like Manuelito, would come in and take cattle to help their people survive, because they had already been colonized by the Spanish for a few hundred years by then, or were fighting to maintain their culture from Spanish colonization. And then the Mormons moved in, and this goes into contemporary history as to like why a lot of Deneta is Mormon, is because from the 40s through to like just about 2000, Mormons were running what they called the Lamanite Student Placement Program, or the Indian Student Placement Program, where they would abduct, human traffic, as well as some people did voluntarily send their kids to these, a foster program where, so they ran this foster program that removed indigenous children from their homes, from their people, from their culture, which is genocide. It's listed in the UN's genocide list of what defines genocide as removing the children from a people with the intention of destroying the people, which is what cultural assimilation is. Anyway, so it was like, I can't remember the number, but I think it was like 20,000 children were taken from their homes. They lived with Mormon homes. They were forbidden from practicing their culture, speaking their language, because for Christians, those things were evil. They were like devilish, and especially for Mormons, because Mormons believe that all indigenous people are, in a sense, ancient Mormons, because the Book of Mormon teaches that the the people who had divine right to this land, who are the ancestors of indigenous people, were living a pre-Mormon belief system. So this was a project to restore these, so-called restore these people to their previously divine state. And so again, like Lake Powell, the Hoover Dam, or not Hoover Dam, the Glen Canyon Dam. What's that town that's right by the dam? Page, and there's a couple other towns that were actually founded by Mormons for Dene to assimilate to this culture. Anyway, so that's one of the reasons that Dene are so Christian. Like, a lot of the council leadership will like read the Bible in council meetings and stuff, and so that comes from that kind of colonization. And so it's a complicated thing, but they were in part successful. And like the Protect ICWA, during the proceedings that led to the Indigenous Child Welfare Act being passed, Mormons were successful in arguing for an exemption from that law. So even after the 70s, after 73, when ICWA was passed, Mormons were able to continue practicing the Lamanite placement program, the foster boarding school program, the genocidal program, when so many others weren't.
This piece made me think of my family's history and like the disconnects that we have in our culture, and it definitely makes me wonder and want to like do more research into my family and our ancestors, because so far I've only been able to really research like up until my grandma's grandma, and she was an orphan and was like, I can't remember who she was raised by, but later married a Navajo man, so they got to like continue their culture in some sense. But it's really interesting thinking about how my family is so different from other Navajo families, and like a friend of mine who comes from medicine people who specifically got to escape like the long walk and hid successfully and got to keep a lot of their traditions. And so the layers of like colonization and the way we think about like our families and our culture is so interesting, because many times we just don't know, because of those systems that have like purposefully erased these things and our connections. So yeah, it's really definitely helpful for like my perspective to hear about like how have people interacted with our land kind of without the land's permission. And you're speaking about like kind of giving apologies to the land and like reconnecting in a more intentional way, which sounds like just so beautiful, and like it would be helpful for everybody who might not even realize they have like bias or a lack of understanding to their connection to things. And for me, like my mom is white, so conversely with my white family, I also see a lot of these systems and themes, I guess, that they don't have an understanding of themselves, even though they kind of like pride themselves on, you mentioned like the nuclear family and like all these things that people might see as like the best thing to do, right? Like for your culture, for your, I don't even think like many people think about the world that way too, of like, how are we going to be extending our culture? How are we going to be extending the livelihood and wellness of our people versus just like, how am I gonna like grow old and have the most money basically. Mm-hmm. So I see a lot of those contrasts in like my close family and my distant family. So it's just really interesting to hear about. So thank you.
Yeah, and there's a lot of layers to even just what you said. So the Indigenous Child Welfare Act was established because the American Indian movement, they were doing a lot of activism and a lot of work around that period, because so we have a few periods. We have overt genocide era, which the overt biological genocide era for the most part ends in the 1890s when the U.S. has colonized from sea to shining sea, and pretty much all indigenous peoples are forced onto reservations by this point. Then we move into Dawes Act era of forcing indigenous peoples to adopt U.S. European style governance and family structures and government structures, as well as private property structures. And then we move into taking that back away, and we have the tribal termination era, which is when all indigenous nations lose federal well, not all. The plan was eventually to get all of them to lose in federal recognition. Didn't work out. That was also, by the way, a Mormon program in order to save indigenous peoples by turning them into white Americans. And then the tribal termination era gets ended, and then the next way of saving indigenous peoples moves into fostering, into stealing, basically, the child welfare, whatever that's called, the administration of child welfare. And so they would come in and be like, oh, you all don't have wealth in the way we recognize wealth, so you're poor, you're unable to take care of your children in a way we deem appropriate. So we're going to take them from you and place them with a family who has this wealth, which are, surprise, surprise, white. And this was happening so much that I think it's 25% by like the mid 60s, 25% of indigenous children did not live with their people. And so that leads to ICWA. Mormons get an exemption from that and get to keep removing children from their families because, they also get to get home in the summer. So, like, we're not just totally destroying them. But also, like, being orphaned. Being orphaned often means your parents died at an age when you were still young. Brigham Young's quote of, like, let the women and children live if they behave themselves. That's because they were kidnapping the women and children and enslaving them, marrying them, adopting them. Like, if you read a Mormon faith-promoting narrative of this, they will say that they were marrying and adopting them and they were becoming family, but the women would be the servants. So, like, they were still practicing polygamy, and the white women, the white wives, had higher power and authority than the indigenous wives. So the indigenous wives were essentially like house workers, but yeah, they had married them.
And the wives were the wives of men who Mormons had killed.
Yes. They were already someone else's family, and the children were already someone else's children, and they would adopt those children. And also, another side of this that it also rarely is talked about Mormon-style polygamy is that it's divine classism, essentially, because the more wives you have, the wealthier you are, because women and children were property at that period in time. And if you were able to have multiple wives, it means you had more money, and you had to have multiple wives to get to the highest tier of heaven at this time. And so it's a pyramid structure of class where the highest class gets to be the highest gods. Anyway, so yeah, that history of adoption and destruction of culture through taking children from their families through massacres or legislative violence is also a very long history that continues on today.
In like you said, like overt ways. Like it's very, many times we talk about history in like this context with our work, and it, to some audiences, I wonder, like, do they know we're talking about like something that's affecting people right now?
Yeah.
Like these things have not gone away. And I bring up like my grandma's grandma because of that, those systems that continue on. Like I wonder exactly like how, kind of like in mind, what's the butterfly effect that from however she was made an orphan to how I became a foster kid. Like those things are not like separate in my mind.
No.
So when I tell stories and like, or explain to people like where I come from, it's really, I listen to like what they're like taking out of it and like how they're understanding. But yeah, also like my journey of understanding is also growing. am definitely learning more and more exactly how all these things are connected, because they always have been.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I relate a lot because, like, the way I hear my grandma talking about her marriage and just all these things that I'm like, wow, that's so, like, oppressive and unequal. And then I go back, like, 7 generations to Zaina, who was married to all these different men forcibly. Like, she didn't want that. It's also the same thing. Like, they're completely connected, and that shows up in my life too, and like my belief systems, and that's mine to unpack now. Which leads me to my next question. In your own life, Nick, how has learning about your ancestors and your history impacted how you live and how you're showing up in the world?
I might ask you to re-ask the question because I want to start a little further back, which is, so the nuclear family is a tool of settler colonialism, because to destroy, you need the military, you need the militias, you need the mostly men. To replace, you need the women and children. A nuclear family, during the Homestead Act, when people were getting basically free stolen land, there were limits on who had access to getting homestead land. And one of basically you needed to be a reproductive white family to get land. And so that was very much a destroy indigenous people to replace them with white people. So, you were saying that we don't, a lot of white people don't really think about the perpetuation of culture. They're just like, have kids, make a family, and make as much money as you can. When that is our culture. Yeah, like yes, we're unaware of it because that's one of the early things that got me is like, what's white culture? And I was like, shit,
Consumption.
I don't know what white culture is, but it's because it's the invisible culture. It's the culture that is omnipresent and thus invisible. It's settler colonialism, which is another one of those lines from the I think it's Eva Hess. No, that's an artist. Shoot, I'm not remembering the author's name right now. Yeah, Eve Tuck. That she writes about that settler colonialism is made all that much more evil by its invisibilization. Its perpetuation makes it invisible because it's gone on so long that, I had people when I was making all my posts, early on after October 7th, that someone actually told me like, oh, but our genocides are over. And I was like, what? My goodness. No, they are ongoing, friend. We're not done. Mauna Kea, you all could list them better than I can, but yeah, there are so many ways at which the settler project is continuing to occupy and steal land for more and more and more resources and destroying indigenous connection to each other and their lands. So the family is a really important part of the settler colonial project, the white nuclear family, because it also destroys indigenous family systems, which were often not the nuclear family. Like, you were connected through generations. Is another layer of how we're disconnected, is that the nuclear family is a form of disconnection, not connection, which Mormons have a slogan that's families are forever. But there's an invisible asterisk on that phrase that families are forever so long as they follow the laws and rules of Mormonism. So really, this church that positions itself as a family-centered religion separates more families than it binds. I attended my mom's funeral and got to talk about how, according to her belief system, we don't get to be together in death, which is messed up. But so that your question is, how is this impacting my own life? And you were talking about like the women in your family, and this is more of like a smaller anecdote, but I've been doing the research since 2020. No, that's when I started the Instagram page, 2018. So it's 7 years now. And I'm starting to get to the point where I am making it even more personal. So this is where I'm less practiced at talking about it, so I'm pausing more. But I'm starting to learn to connect with my ancestors, which has been a complicated thing because I know what they did, and it's hard to want to connect with that because another aspect of white culture is it's called settler move to innocence, and it's where you distance yourself from anything related to the less pleasant parts of who we are, and you ignore those and replace them with, oh, I'm so connected to land. You know, I love camping and hiking and listening to rocks, and so I'm one of the good ones.
I feel good, therefore I am good.
Exactly. I am comfortable, thus I am good.
Yes.
And so it's been a complicated thing, but I've been starting to find through, because it's basically, I went into this work with a like, I'm going to fix everything. Like there was some white saviorism in this, because I was going to fix it. I was going to show all the white people who we are, and we were going to change, and revolution was going to happen, and indigenous people were going to get their lands back, and you know, the earth was going to heal, and you know, the dolphins would come back and whatever else. And because I had that attitude, I was working with a sense of urgency of like, okay, I'm going to do this work. It's going to be hard and painful, and then things are going to be fixed, and then I can relax. Totally unsustainable, really damaging. I've had to slow down a lot to start working on some grief work. And so one of the ways it has changed my everyday life is, one, I see my environment and my surrounding very differently than I used to. But two is it's brought me closer to myself. It's brought me closer to my grief. It's allowed and encouraged me and sort of put me where I must or perish. You know, a lot of the time, if you don't do your, what people call shadow work, it will do to you. It will happen to you. Like, you know, a smaller example of that is if I don't take the rest I need to take, I end up getting sick so that I will rest. So that's kind of what happened, is I got grief sick because I was constantly ingesting all of these horrors and not addressing them. Anyway, through that, I've started doing more ancestral work, and I was recently getting some body work done with a friend, and they were noticing, basically I was having back problems and hip problems, and through that, it was this experience that my body is trying to protect itself, like at my core, so my hips were like closing, which then put extra stress on my back, so my back was starting to hurt, and your back is where your ancestors are somatically. And so it was basically, a lot of my ancestors don't like what I'm doing. Some of them because they're still arrogant pricks, and some of them because I'm not acknowledging their humanity. Like Alma Helaman Hale. His mother's dying words were, "Do not leave this church," because her brother left the church. Her brother was that apostle who took a gun into a temple. And so her dying words were, "Stay with the church. This is true. It's good. Stay with it." And he was 10. So, like, you know, I need to acknowledge that, of like, what would I have done if my 10-year-old self, my mom's dying words were like, "Keep doing this"? Yeah, I probably would have killed people for it, because that's what everyone around me was doing.
That's what they were taught.
That's what he was taught. He was one of the youngest wagon drivers of the Manifest Destiny movement. Like, so like, I also need to honor their humanity, which kind of, you know, I think is, I'm getting into intermediate and advanced settler colonialism, I think, at this point, or settlers being anti-settler colonial, because I don't think that's your first step. But we do have to recognize that these are also people, and they made mistakes, and I hope that in death they can recognize that those were mistakes. But also within that, as I've started to feel and find that most of my ancestors who are with me are the women. And my hips closing in on themselves with what is this attempt to protect myself from living in an inherently unsafe world. Right now, we have a lot of propaganda about how transism is a death cult. I'm non-binary. I'm not safe. No one is safe, let alone, like, we're descending deeper into fascism. There's climate collapse and the sixth extinction and militant violence and, you know, technological violence constantly all around. Like, none of us are safe. And the women in my family have never been safe. Thinking of their core, of the base of their body, the women in my family have never chosen their sexual relationships. The abuse that I had in my family, my bio dad is a rapist. None of my mom's kids were conceived in her choice. I'm a product of rape. All of the women in my ancestry were property. It wasn't until this generation that women have the financial means to live alone. Marriage is a financial hostage system. It has been for, years of our lives. And so I don't know these things because I don't think they would have written them down, but I don't think any of the women in my family have ever had a choice of choosing their sexual life. And so what kind of wisdom can I learn from that? What kind of wisdom can they bring to me of how to live well when your life is inherently unsafe and you don't necessarily have a choice about that? And so I think those are the kinds of things that in a lot of, this work has changed me in a lot of ways in that I see my world entirely differently. It's an entirely different perspective. Like, I didn't go back to grad school to get richer and find a better job. I studied art. That was not going to happen. I went back to school to improve my life. Changing the way you understand the world you live in, even when it involves grief, probably especially when it involves grief, because we all have a lot to grieve and we're not good at that, especially Christian people, because everybody's like, oh, they're in a better place. We bypass grief all the time. We justify all of our violences. We bypass death. We avoid all of those kinds of fruitful things in our life. Like, pain is a fruitful experience. It can be. That doesn't mean we need to make more pain. It means pain exists in existence. And so let's help each other because life is painful. But it is a good teacher. And so that grief has really helped me learn and helped me connect and also find in those similar veins that none of us are healthy in settler colonialism. It destroys all of us. The men who did these things to the women were not healthy. The women who experienced these things were not healthy. The women who ran the boarding schools, who forcibly taught children Christianity and U.S. style of education, which are really re-education camps. We always point to the Nazis in the U.S. as we're going through all this further descent into fascism, when it's like, we have examples here, you guys. We have the KKK. We have boarding schools. We have re-education camps. We have patriarchal violence. We have no respect for families and diversity and children. Like, children are still property. They have no rights. Anyway, so that I think that's really where it shaped me, is it's just helped me see the world differently, and it's honestly helped me in being in these experiences. I'm not confused by the propaganda around Charlie Kirk's murder. I'm not confused around the propaganda around January 6th, around Trump becoming president. I don't say this isn't us, because I know this is absolutely us. This is who we've been all along. And we're not going to change unless we address that, which involves grieving it. It's not just being in the streets and yelling. Anger is absolutely essential. Grief is also absolutely essential. And so, yeah, this is a really unpleasant thing to study. It's really hard to learn. It's hard to know that this is who I am, that these things are in my blood. And also, you don't heal unless you face those things. We are haunted by our past because we ignore it. We are haunted by it. We would actually be able to do something if we stopped ignoring it, if we stopped pretending this isn't who we are. It is who we are. It's who we've always been. And the positive sides, our liberal side, is just as much to blame. Boarding schools were a liberal program. The Indian placement program, the Indian student placement program was a liberal program. These were uplift. These were charitable. These were about welfare. So we also have to recognize that there aren't good guys in our system right now that are going to help us out of it. We have to radically alter the system, which again is why I do this work. Is one of the earliest things I learned in studying art and ecology is that globally, indigenous peoples protect 80% of the biodiversity on the planet. Biodiversity is a form of safety, even though safety also kind of just doesn't exist. But it's risk avoidance, because most of our food systems right now are monocultures. Humans and mostly cattle, all the mammals that we eat, humans and the mammals we eat are 96% of the mammalian biomass, and only 4% is wild animals. These stats are both like 10 years old, so it's probably worse now. But yeah, that's like lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Like, those are mammals. Those are huge animals, and we way outweigh them. Cattle, the majority of Holstein cows on the planet are descended from 2 bulls because we selectively breed them. We jerked off these 2 bulls a whole bunch of times and collected all their semen, and then we continue to impregnate all the Holstein cattle with this semen because these cows make the most milk-producing cows. So they have no biological diversity because they're only descendants of 2 things. So if certain viruses hit their populations, we might just lose all the Holstein cows. Same thing with our corn, which is it's a stolen thing. Like, corn is indigenous to this continent. We've turned it into a monocrop that can be wiped out with one simple disease. Bananas are the same way. Like, so much of our food system has disconnected itself from land and life. And so it's really vulnerable to collapse. Indigenous peoples, not because they're magical, avatar, blue-skinned people, but because they stay where they are. They go through the hard times, and they learn from their mistakes. Chaco Canyon collapsed, I've been told, by Patuche, Patuche? He's a Acoma elder, and he told me that Chaco Canyon failed because the people of that era had a similar kind of power over their environment that we have now, and they abused that power. And so their environment collapsed and they had to move. And so indigenous people aren't some magical, half animal being. I mean, we're all animals, but yeah. The Avatar movies, the romanticization of indigenous people, that's not why they protect land. They protect land because they stayed there. Their languages evolved out of the land. They understand it because they have generations and generations of experience. Europeans left Europe because they were overpopulating it and running out of the ability to continue practicing their private property, farming style life ways. They fled to spread. They didn't address their problems where they were. They spread their problems across the world. So that's why indigenous people protect 80% of the land's biodiversity while only having access and management over 25% of the land on Earth, is because of their relationship, their connections to the land. And so that gives me hope. Like, I'm not a nihilist. I don't know that I'm like, in my lifetime, am I hopeful for that? Maybe not so much. But through deep time, because again, this is all rooted in my relationship with stone and the wisdom that they carry, because they've already seen so many collapses. And life does go on. And there is a bit of ego clinging, believing that it needs to happen in my life. Again, lot to grieve, but there's hope in that. That, like, this will keep going. And I also don't fall for the, overpopulation, humans are the virus BS. Because humans aren't the virus. Certain ones seem to spread like viral diseases, but yeah, there's nothing. Humans are an amazing species. We're incredible. Sometimes incredibly violent, but we are incredible. And so, that gives me hope. Again, this is a 500-year-old project, at least, and so it's going to take a long time to course correct. But it's course correctable. This isn't an inevitability that we are a doomed species. So in a lot of ways, even though this does bring a lot of hard feelings and beliefs and things I have to process into my life, it also gives me clarity, hope, and makes me more grounded and not easily swayed by the constant propaganda we're exposed to. Makes me rooted, which is radical, by the way.
Wanting more for all that we care about.
Yep. It's rooted in love.
Totally.
I think that's a great note to end on. Thank you so much, Nick. I feel like I have no words. That was amazing. I have a lot to chew on. But yeah, thank you so much for coming here and just being vulnerable and sharing all your really hard-earned wisdom. It's really an honor to have you here. Are there any last-minute things you want to add, or where can people plug in and see more of your work?
The work that's focused on Mormonism, I have an Instagram page called Unsettling Mormonism. For the most part, I'm reposting things, but it's always good to be reminded of stuff. Otherwise, my artwork is on my page, which is nicholasbjacobsen.com, S-E-N at the end of Jacobsen. And yeah, if you want to contact me more, there's contact information there. And I want to say thank you to you both for having me. Like, there's not a lot of time and place to have these conversations, I think, so I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the work you all are doing, because very similarly, you all are getting closer to the trouble rather than trying to distance yourself from it. The work you all do is hard and painful, and you're constantly seeing the realities of our legislative systems, which I think, when you're younger, you might have some hope in those. And the closer you get to them, the more you realize that they're kind of fixed. And so very, very similarly, this is the kind of work that brings you closer to the grief, and you have to keep showing up to the grief even as it continues to be painful. And that is really important work, because we don't get out of these messes unless we do it.
Exactly.
So thank you all for having me and for the work you do, because it's invaluable.
Thank you so much. The last thing I want to say about this last portion that you talked about is about like the grief work you've been going through for this yourself, and like the work that you do. It's extremely needed. I also sort of had like you called it a grief sickness. Like, maybe there's another word for that, like similar to sickness, just like I had to purge it all. Like, it just came to a point where like I knew like this is not sustainable anymore. But so many people live thinking it's normal because they've not been taught anything else.
Yeah.
So thank you for talking about that.
Yep. We won't be helpful if we don't help ourselves. Exactly. Which is only half the work, so don't bypass by only doing the self-care. But if we don't heal, we won't be able to contribute to these movements well.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah.
And we hope to have you back again.
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you.